Hello, welcome to Regime Technologies. I am Venkat. This is part 23 of ASP.NET video series. In this session, we'll learn about the ASP.NET checkbox list control. Before continuing with the session, I strongly recommend to watch parts 16, 17, and 21 of this video series. In these parts, we have discussed about drop-down list control. The concepts related to drop-down list control are also equally applicable to checkbox list control. In fact, both of these controls falls under list controls category. Within ASP.NET, we have other list controls like radio button list, bulleted list, list box, etc. Whatever concepts that we discussed today are also equally applicable to these other list controls that are available in ASP.NET. We will be talking about them in a later video session. Just like a drop-down list, checkbox list is also a collection of list item objects. Items can be added to the checkbox list in the HTML source at the design time or in the code behind file programmatically. Checkbox list can be bound to a database table or an XML file. We have seen how to actually bind a drop-down list to a database table or an XML file. Drop-down list is generally used when we want to present the user with multiple choices from which we want him to select only one option, whereas if you want the user to select more than one option, then a checkbox list control can be used. Let's look at an example. I have a simple ASP.NET web application project here. Let's drag and drop the checkbox list control from the toolbox onto the web form, and we know that checkbox list is a collection of list item objects, and these list item objects can be added in the HTML source at the design time or programmatically in the code behind file. And we know that a list item object has got text and value properties. Okay, so let's display the list of education levels within this checkbox list control. For example, diploma, graduate, post-graduation, doctorate, etc. Now I have these list item objects already typed just to save some time. Okay, so as you can see, we have diploma, graduate, and postgraduate and doctorate having values 1, 2, 3, 4. So if I flip the web form to the design mode, you can see all of the list item objects listed here, but then they are present in a vertical direction. Is it possible to change the direction of these list item objects? Absolutely. You just have to flip one property called repeat direction. So repeat direction at the moment is vertical, change it to horizontal. That's it. Okay, now if you look at these list item objects, all of them are displayed in one column. Is it possible to display them in 2 or more columns? Absolutely. Again, go to the properties, and then you have repeat columns. By default it's 0, which means all the list item objects will be shown in one column. If I set that to 2, look at what's going to happen. These will get distributed across 2 columns. Alright, and there is another property called enabled for each list item object. Now if you remember, when we discussed about the drop down list control, if you set the enabled property of a list item object within the drop down list to false, then that list item object will be invisible within the drop down list when the page renders. But whereas if you set the enabled property to false for a list item object within this checkbox list, then what's going to happen when we run this, that list item object, it will be rendered, but the user will not be able to check or uncheck that checkbox. Look at that, that's disabled now, but the others, we can select them. So anytime you want to disable or prevent the user from selecting a specific choice, all you have to do is set the enabled property of that list item object to false. Okay, before discussing about the selected index value and item properties, we will actually see how to retrieve the text value and the index of each list item object that the user has selected. Now remember, let's remove this enabled property for the diploma. And if you flip to the design mode, they're spread across 2 columns, but let's remove that. Okay, so remember, From a checkbox list control, a user can select more than one list item object. In the drop-down list, a user can select only one list item object. So you can simply use drop-down list one dot selected item, and then you can say dot text or dot value. That's simple. But in a checkbox list control, a user has the option of selecting more than one list item object. If that's the case, I want to retrieve the text, value, and the index of each list item object that the user has selected. So let's drag and drop a button control. So when the user clicks that button, that's when I want to do that. So let's double click the button control, which generates the event handler. Okay, so response.write. So we want the text. So text is equal to. Okay, now remember, the user can select more than one list item objects. So we need to loop through each list item object within this checkbox list control. So obviously, to loop through each list item object, we can make use of the for each loop. So for each, we know that a drop-down list or a checkbox list is a collection of list item objects. So for each list item, li in, what's the name of our checkbox list control? It's checkbox list 1. So let's copy the ID. And then this checkbox list 1 has got this items collection, which basically returns the list of list item objects. So we are looping through each list item within that collection. So if you look at that, this is a list item collection. Okay, so once we have the list item object, all you have to do is you have to check if that list item is selected. And how do we do that? You can use the selected property of that list item object. So, and if you look at the selected property, it's Boolean, which means it returns true if it's selected, otherwise it returns false. And some people use this incorrectly. I mean, it's not incorrect, but there's no reason why you should be doing this. If li.selected is equal to true, selected is already Boolean. You don't have to compare it again to a Boolean value of true. You can simply say if li.selected, which means if that list item object is selected, then what we want to do, we want to select the text. So response.write text is equal to li.text. And then let's put a space and a comma so that the output will be properly formatted. And similarly, I want the value. So if you want the value, we know that li has got a value property as well. So li.value. And what else we want? We want the index of the list item object within that checkbox list. And if you want the index, that's a little different to achieve, because on the list item we don't have the index property. So if you look at this, when I say li dot, you don't find the index property there. Okay, now you want the index of this list item within that checkbox list. So the way we achieve that is checkbox list 1 in the items collection, find the index. Index of what? The list item object that the user has selected. So if you look at the IntelliSense, you know, this index of method is expecting a list item object to be passed. So I am passing the list item object there. And since this is the last one, we don't have to append the space and comma there. And let's put an HTML break at the end so that each selection will come in its own line. Alright, so now if we run this, and once we select our choices and when we click the button, each selected items, list items, text, value, and index should be displayed within the browser window. So if I don't select anything, I click the button, nothing will happen. Why? Because it tries to loop through each item, nothing is selected, so it wouldn't come into this block at all. So on the other hand, if I select, let's say, doctorate, I click this button, look at that, text is equal to doctorate, this is value is equal to 4 and index is equal to 3. We have the incorrect output. That's because we haven't changed this string. So value is equal to and index is equal to. So now let's run that again and we should see the correct labels now. Okay, so I select graduate, click the button, text is equal to graduate, value is equal to 2, index is equal to 1. And you can actually verify that. So if you look at that, graduate is at position 1 within that checkbox list. Diploma is at 0th position, postgraduate 2, and that's the index basically, and these are the values. Okay, so if I select all of them, obviously all of them should be displayed. So if you want to retrieve the text value and the index of all the list item objects within the checkbox list, we basically use the for each loop and then use that selected property to determine if the list item object is selected or not. Okay, now can't I use the selected index, selected value, and selected item properties of the checkbox list control? Absolutely, you can use them. For the drop down list. That's what we use. Even for the checkbox list control, you can use them. But the problem is they only return the first selected item. So what we mean by that, let's comment this for the time being. So when we were discussing about drop down list, we spoke about the selected index, for example. Even checkbox list control supports that property. So checkbox list 1 dot selected index, look at that, that's an integer. Okay, let's write that response dot write. Since that is an integer, let's convert that to string. Now if I go ahead and run this, look at what's going to happen. Now when we run this and when we select more than one option, only the item which has got the lowest index that will be returned. Look at that, I'm selecting graduate and doctorate. If I click the button, it only returns me 1. 0 is diploma, that's the index of diploma. 1 is for graduate, so I am getting only 1. If I select diploma and click the button, I only get 0. So since checkbox list control allows multiple selections, if you use the selected index property, then it returns to you only the first selected item. Okay, or the item with the lowest ordinal index. On the other hand, if I don't select anything and then click that button, then I get -1, because look at that, I didn't select anything. I get -1. And this is one way to identify if the user has selected anything at all within that checkbox list control or not. Not only for checkbox list control, we can use that for drop down list or list box or any list control for that matter. Similarly, you can use the selected value property. So instead of selected index, I can use the selected value property. Again, selected value property is the same thing. It only returns the selected value of the one item. And if you select multiple values, it only returns the selected value of one item. Look at that. I click that, I get the diploma. I select a graduate, I still get that one. Okay, if I don't select anything, when I click the button, it basically returns an empty string, and that's why an empty string cannot be printed, so that's why there's nothing. But on the other hand, if I select postgraduate, I get the correct value. So remember, selected index and selected value properties can also be used, but they only return the index and value of the one list item object. Similarly, I can use the selected item property. Again, the same idea, selected item returns only one item. And then I can use the text and value property to retrieve the text and value of that list item object. So if I run this now, obviously I'll be able to retrieve the text of the selected item. Along the same lines, you can also retrieve the value. For example, I selected graduate, I click this button, I see graduate, but when I select diploma, now I only get the text of diploma list item object. So only one item. If I don't select anything, that's when the danger is. When I click this button, what's going to happen? You can expect that now selected item will be null. There's nothing selected in the drop down list. So when I click this button, selected item property will return null. On a null object, you're trying to retrieve text property. So what's going to happen? As you can expect, null reference exception. So when I click this button now, look at what's going to happen. Object reference not set to an instance of an object. This is the nothing but null reference exception, and that makes sense. So that's why it's very important that if you are using the selected item property, make sure you check for nulls. Maybe we can say if checkbox list 1.selectedItem not equal to null, only then try to retrieve the text or value property out of it. Because if the user does not select anything, selected item will return null, and calling the text or value property on a null object will throw null reference exception, object reference not set to an instance of an object. Okay, so now when we run this, and if you don't select anything, obviously this condition will become false and this piece of code will not get executed, and we don't end up with that null reference exception. So I click this button, I don't get any error, but if I select, I get the selected items text as expected. So check for null when using selected item property of a checkbox list control. On this slide, you can find resources for ASP.NET C# and SQL Server interview questions. That's it for today. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.